This is a story about hot dogs and Kool-Aid. Let me explain. I grew up in Ottawa's East End in the early 80s. Remember the 80s? Yeah. Inspector Gadget was our early morning cartoon. Video Hits was our source of music. Neon belonged on all our clothing. And Brian Mulroney was the Prime Minister. Back then, there weren't a whole lot of newly arrived immigrant families like ours. And yet, I didn't feel too differently. Our parents encouraged us to take part in everything. The lighting of the Christmas tree at school, caroling with the Brownies troupe, exchanging Valentine's Day cards with my classmates, and of course, trick-or-treating our neighbors' houses. But there was one thing: the school hot dogs. Those were a no-no. You see, my mom couldn't be absolutely certain that there wasn't any pork in them. And so I had to sit that one out. And while my friends chowed down, I felt different. And when you're 9 years old, different feels weird. But any embarrassment I had about that, or other things like how hard it was to pronounce or spell my last name, was alleviated by a school principal who taught me to embrace my differences. Mr. Ron Coleman. I remember his name to this day. One afternoon, he came up to me in the hallway and he said, "Amira, would you and your friends like to present on Islam at a school assembly?" Me, I remember thinking, present in front of the entire school? Absolutely. Now, I didn't know a whole lot about the topic, but I must have figured I could get up to speed on 1,400 years of history in no time. I convinced my friends, there were about 5 of us, and our moms were on board. We gave a great presentation. It was a lot of fun. And that was the moment. The moment I drank the Kool-Aid. You know, that distinctly Canadian flavor called multiculturalism. I carried that childhood memory with me right to high school, where I filled up on even more of that sugary drink. The school's multicultural club was a source of inspiration and motivation for a student body that represented over 100 countries. And Monsieur Michel-Ange Hippolyte, well, he was both my science teacher and Kool-Aid dispenser extraordinaire. You see, for years, he'd give up one lunch break every week to supervise our club. He would offer us guidance and advice in his beautiful Haitian accent. He was so proud of his culture, and it was infectious. He taught us all to appreciate where we came from. We would share that pride once a year at the annual Multicultural Show. It would attract students and parents from right across the city. And throughout the year, we'd take opportunities to bring dishes from home. We'd try out foods we'd never ever heard of, sometimes couldn't even pronounce, but found delicious. Were there any hot dogs in any of those casseroles? Probably. But the sheer variety meant that no one had to sit those gatherings out. Empowered by those sorts of experiences, it was off to university. I was eager and open to learning about my peers and professors. I was unafraid to ask questions and make arguments in classes of up to 200 students. It felt so good to wholeheartedly belong. Now, up until then, I didn't know much about Canada's colonial, shameful relationship with Indigenous communities. And I didn't know anything about anti-Black racism or other forms of discrimination. Honestly, I hadn't even heard of Islamophobia. Back then, I didn't wear a headscarf, and clad head to toe in Gap clothing, I fit right in. Sure, sometimes someone would ask me, where are you really from? But I always took it as a question out of curiosity, never out of malice. Canada was a beautiful mosaic, and I was just happy to be a part of it. Then came the time that I decided I wanted to explore my spiritual inheritance. Faith for me up until then was, I don't know, celebrating Ramadan with an Eid party. Who doesn't love a party, right? Or once in a while going to the mosque with my family. And if I hadn't studied for exams, a hurried prayer for good measure. I decided that my heart needed more. And for me, the first step was to don a headscarf. And you know who I had to convince of my decision? Well, my dad. You see, he had major reservations, even before 9/11 would completely change people's perceptions of my clothing choices. After all, he'd immigrated to Canada with the simple hopes that his kids would fit in, succeed, live the Canadian dream. He had faced racism and discrimination firsthand as he struggled to establish what would eventually be a successful career in engineering. You know, he even considered naming me Karen. My mom won that argument. I remember spending an entire weekend hashing things out with him. "Are you sure you want to do this?" he asked me. "It's going to create barriers for you." He was so worried that such a visible change in how I looked was going to stand in the way of my career goals. But remember, I had drunk the Kool-Aid. "Dad," I told him, with all the inspiration and confidence inspired in me by Mr. Coleman and Monsieur Hippolyte and countless others, "if I can't be who I want to be here in Canada and fully contribute to society, where else could I do it?" And I convinced him. And I proved to him that I'd been right to have drunk that Kool-Aid. I found steady work as a journalist. I was able to both practice my faith and dispel stereotypes while doing it. At the Toronto Star, one of the few columnists of color congratulated me for being the first woman in a hijab to work in the newsroom. And I appreciated his words, but I also remember thinking, why had it taken so long? It was slowly starting to dawn on me that despite all the song and dance and samosas, that representation was still a work in progress. I was starting to realize that in newsrooms, for instance, the vast majority of reporters, editors, columnists were often male and pale. I would soon learn that in many civic agencies and companies, true diversity remained elusive, especially as one looked at higher and higher levels of senior leadership. I started to finally understand why my dad had been so worried. And then tragically, 9/11 happened. Since then, the Kool-Aid has all but run dry. That painful period was a hard slap for those of us who had been blind to racism. Those of us who'd been privileged enough, like me, to not have experienced the marginalization that far too many face. 9/11 brought all of that to the forefront for me in a way I could not have anticipated. Soon, Muslims and those perceived as Muslims were being attacked, vilified, their houses of worship vandalized, sometimes even set on fire. Working in the media, I had a front row seat to the questions people were asking, and I was grateful to be there to help look for answers. I remember booking one of my journalism professors for the morning show. Kareem had just published a book that looked at how Western media had often portrayed Muslims as a threat. He told our listeners he thought that it was only going to get worse now. And 1 year later, I reported on how our communities were still reeling, still scared, forced to bear the unfair suspicion and stigma. I longed to believe that I could still be who I was, a proud Canadian Muslim woman of Egyptian heritage. But some women were removing their headscarves, worried about being assaulted on the streets, or feeling a chill at work from colleagues and supervisors who seemed to value their contributions a little less. My journalism would evolve into advocacy. I would find myself at the forefront of defending our human rights, and by extension, the rights of all Canadians. Joining like-minded folks working in civil society, we would stand up against racist policies and racist bullies. Bullies who'd never known what it was like to be excluded, ignored. Racist bullies who had never wanted to drink the Kool-Aid. We would watch social media weaponized against our communities, amplifying misinformation and lies. And some politicians would take advantage, using fear and ignorance to win popular support. Time and time again, we found our loyalty being questioned and our humanity diminished. Today, there are plenty of people who don't believe I belong here. I've had cars and trucks swerve dangerously close to me as their drivers yell, "Go back to where you came from," or "Take that thing off your head." To experience these things in the very neighborhoods I grew up in has been deeply hurtful and disorienting. And I feel sick to my stomach when I read polls that say things like, 1 in 4 Canadians believes it's more and more acceptable to discriminate against Muslims, or that 40% of Canadians believes that there are too many immigrants in Canada and too many who are non-white. Hate crimes targeting Muslims, Jewish people, Black people, and others are at record-level highs. Online hate in this country grew by 600% during Donald Trump's presidential run. My daughter, 11 at the time, learned about the massacre at a Quebec City mosque from a friend on Facebook. The murderous rampage that led a young man so consumed by hatred to walk into a mosque after evening prayers and kill 6 men in cold blood. He left 17 children without their fathers. 2 years later, my daughter was at a sleepover with friends, and they were on Snapchat. They would stumble on a video of another massacre happening half a world away in Christchurch, New Zealand. We were all asleep. We didn't know they were looking at footage of the shooting of over 50 worshipers at 2 mosques. When we woke up, we could barely make sense of the horror ourselves, let alone comfort our children. To be a Muslim, to be a minority, to be an immigrant or the child of immigrants, to be different is so much harder now than it ever was for me growing up. It's looking over your shoulder when you're standing at a bus stop. It's looking over your shoulder when you're standing in prayer in a house of worship. It's hoping you get a job even though your name sounds the way it does. It's trying to ignore the dirty looks you sometimes feel when you're standing in line at the grocery store or when you're picking up your kids from school. It's having to explain why so many of our communities feel let down by public institutions that were meant to protect them and represent them. And yes, it's having to talk about things like brownface and blackface, and having to push so hard to have a deeper conversation about the daily discrimination that's happening to far too many of our communities all the time. It's having to talk about systemic discrimination and how it's holding us back. But every day we face more and more unapologetic racism. We would be foolish if we were to ignore the rise of white supremacy here and around the world. So how do we solve for this? How do we nurture the inclusive communities all of us deserve to live in? Well, here's what I tell myself and my kids and my dad. as long as there are people like you out there. People who are willing to listen to each other, to bear witness to humanity's differences, to accept them, embrace them, and yes, protect them. Then we can push back against these forces, and yes, we can make sustainable, positive change. As long as there are people who stand up for our Charter of Rights and Freedoms that belongs to all of us equally. People who believe that no one should be treated as a second-class citizen, not for the color of their skin, their gender, what they wear on their head, or any other characteristic that makes them who they are. You are the hope that keeps people like me going. And together, I know that we can be champions of unity, diversity, and love. But what does that even look like? Well, it's the simple things. It's getting to know each other, sharing a smile, but it's also more complex. It's voting and supporting candidates for public office who reflect the demographics of our country. It's supporting elected officials who actually listen and respond to the concerns raised by all communities. It's looking at systemic discrimination in our own workplaces, in public agencies, in all decision-making, and asking ourselves, who's not at the table? How do we get them here? How do we remove barriers to participation to ensure full representation? And then there's the media. It has to get this right. Media narratives shape people's perceptions of reality. Media can build empathy and understanding. We should expect more stories that share the wonderful, incredible contributions of people of all backgrounds to the success of our country. And then there are our schools. Our schools are critical. I was so lucky. I had wonderful experiences in public schools, but we know that that's not always the case for all young people. First and foremost, education must be about truth-telling, about our country's history and its present. Curricula should represent the vast diversity of experiences of all students. And our teachers should reflect the demographics of the classrooms they're teaching in. Whatever role you play in society, whatever position you hold, each and every one of us can speak out against fear and division and speak up for equity and inclusion. We can do it offline, online, with our colleagues, friends, and families. Put another way, it's time to fill up on that multicultural Kool-Aid like never before. And nowadays, there are hot dogs for everyone. There are hot dogs for everyone, vegan, kosher, halal. There is space for all of us, and we are stronger for it. Thank you.